You identify a specific real-world harm. You propose a targeted logistical solution to fix it. But before you can weigh the merits of that action, your proposal is flattened by a massive ideological roadblock. Substantive comparative policy research is increasingly being crowded out of academic debate and policy science. Instead of arguing over which logistical intervention saves the most lives, advocates are forced into defensive posturing against totalizing systemic critiques. This tactic is known as the critique. Drawing heavily from theorists like Karl Marx, the argument asserts that because a specific policy operates within a flawed system, like capitalism, that policy must be categorically rejected. The only acceptable solution becomes the total dismantling of the root cause. This rejection-only framework relies on a logical fallacy that effectively halts rational decision-making by demanding the impossible before allowing the practical. We can navigate this gridlock using the Synergy Slayer framework. This conceptual tool rescues policy analysis without ignoring the insights of critical philosophy. To restore functional comparative research, we must separate two distinct concepts. Advocating for the material consequences of a specific policy does not equal an endorsement of the entire system that policy exists within. The foundational rule of policy evaluation is that an advocate defends the material outcomes of their proposed action. They do not adopt the full belief system, historical baggage, or psychological mindset of the state enacting it. Assuming that any interaction with the state taints the policy is an error of essentialization. Engaging a bureaucratic system to stop an immediate harm does not require you to validate that system's foundational assumptions. This dynamic is embedded in history. A revolutionary movement often utilizes the language, laws, and structures of an oppressive system to achieve independence. If the authors of the Declaration of Independence had rejected every specific grievance in 1776 simply because those individual complaints utilized the existing colonial legal structure, the material progress of the revolution would have stalled. Demanding complete systemic purity before taking a single step paralyzes all material reform. Treating utopian overhaul as a prerequisite makes the pursuit of the best the enemy of the incrementally better. Policy evaluation rests on a single mathematical axiom: opportunity cost. A proposal is weighed against the alternative. Rational deliberation requires us to compare a proposed policy only against a feasible alternative, an action that the actors involved could actually execute in the present moment. The systemic critique breaks this evaluative matrix by committing the nirvana fallacy. It removes the feasible alternative and replaces it with an idealized utopia, shattering any comparative logic under an infinite, unweighable standard. An idealized reality where root causes have already been abolished cannot serve as a valid opportunity cost for addressing an immediate, ongoing harm. You cannot weigh a specific action against a fantasy. This is an image of a refugee camp. When we replace concrete logistical comparisons with debates about unknowable, utopian futures, the victims living in these tents are the ones removed from the equation. To those facing acute starvation or displacement, a generalized call to first overthrow global systems is not a serious counterproposal. It functions as a dismissal of their immediate suffering. Evaluating a real material policy against an idealized philosophical mindset destroys our ability to weigh true opportunity costs. That abstraction harms those locked in crisis by delaying the only feasible actions available. The critique is often incentivized by a competitive trade-off. A generalized systemic indictment provides the maximum strategic benefit with the least effort, allowing a debater to bypass the granular, technical research required to answer a specific policy case. This move toward all-or-nothing systems can mask a lack of integrity. As Nietzsche observed, the will to a system is often a lack of integrity, reducing every debate to a question of whose worldview is fundamentally right, rather than what action is necessary. This creates a state of pseudo-activity. Bombarding institutions with impossible demands looks like participation, but actually masks the decision to avoid real-world engagement. Compare this abstraction to the reality of executive decision-making. Leaders facing a crisis must calculate outcomes using highly flawed, limited alternatives. They do not have the luxury of freezing time to rethink the entire system. During the 1993 Bosnia crisis, political leaders prioritized moral condemnation over rational calculation, refusing to propose practical alternatives. This delay resulted in thousands of deaths before the state eventually adopted the exact realistic interventions it had initially condemned. Political theory loses its ability to distinguish between institutions or help the exploited if it refuses to envision how ideas operate within institutional reality. Radical demands to reject and rethink are not alternative actions. They are mechanisms of delay that sustain the very crises they claim to oppose. We need a structural solution, a way to honor critical philosophy without abandoning concrete logistical action. We resolve this tension using the synergy permutation. On the macro level, you have a broad systemic movement. Its goal is to rethink societal foundations entirely. On the micro level, you have a highly specific, compartmentalized legislative or institutional intervention. The permutation places the micropolicy as a specific logistical sub-issue safely inside the wider critical platform. The test is simple. If a post-transformation utopian society were established tomorrow, would they still need to figure out the logistical details of this specific policy? If the answer is yes, the permutation holds. Legislation passes when advocates build coalitions across different mindsets. You do not need to share a unified ideology to execute a shared logistical goal. Effective organizers frequently rely on this. As Saul Alinsky noted, organizers often use the wrong institutional reasons to persuade the opposition, just to achieve the right humanitarian outcomes. Critical theory retains a vital function in this matrix. It serves as a lens used to scrutinize author credibility and interrogate framing. It is not a gateway used to preclude action entirely. A serious advocate does not abandon critical epistemology. They weaponize it to refine and execute step-by-step institutional reform. Treating debate as an ideological purity test creates severe sociological dangers, where dissent and difference are viewed as inherently offensive. This move to essentialize the state, or your opponent, mirrors totalitarian logic. When you tell other people what they mean because of a theory, individual intent is erased in favor of a rigid, system-level categorization. This purity politics drives ideological isolation. It builds echo chambers where opposing views are dismissed as if already accounted for, breeding toxic polarization and a fear of association. There is a historical risk in fatalistic, vague platitudes. When people are told to reject the system without being offered a viable institutional alternative, it creates a vacuum where grievance can turn into incitement and radicalized hostility. A functional, pluralistic society inherently requires engaging with and compromising with fundamentally different value systems. You must negotiate with the world as it is. Enforcing ideological purity as a prerequisite for action doesn't dismantle oppressive systems. It fuels radicalization and silences the exact democratic deliberation needed to fix them. Academic debate and policy science exist to teach us how to persuade diverse audiences in a pluralist society. A healthy policy ecosystem allows multiple competing ideas and philosophies to coexist, so their material outcomes can be weighed against each other. In this ecosystem, the critical lens acts as a filter to refine our solutions. It is not an eraser to delete them. The modern necessity for diverse, comparative research stands in direct contrast to the dogmatism of absolute ideologues, who historically viewed purity of doctrine as more important than the human cost of their inaction. We must reject the false dichotomy between theory and practice. The abstractly perfect cannot be allowed to act as the enemy of the incrementally better. Intellectual victory is not found in rejecting the system from the outside. It is found in synthesizing theory and action to navigate the complexities of the real world.
Picture this. You have this massive, gleaming sword, right?
Right, yeah.
And it is just completely engulfed in flames.
Okay, sounds pretty intense.
Oh, it is. And engraved heavily right along the blade are the words, "The Synergy Slayer."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this flaming sword is slicing straight downward through a stack of these thick, red, gold-embossed books. And if you look closely at the book covers being cleaved in two, you can actually make out the faces of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin.
I mean, it is an incredibly striking piece of imagery. It feels, like the cover of some wild fantasy novel. But it's actually the artwork for a really dense 2026 academic paper.
Right. The paper by Alex Kulikov.
Exactly. It's titled Slayer of Debate Critical Theory. And the imagery really sets up this complex argument about ideology, action, and just total paralysis.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. We have a literal mountain of notes and source material drawn from this paper. And the mission of our deep dive today is to explore how this highly specific kind of niche tactic used in competitive academic debate actually mirrors a massive, invisible crisis in how you, the listener, and society at large operate.
Yeah, it maps directly onto how we make decisions, right?
Yeah.
How we argue about politics and, well, ultimately why we often fail to fix the world.
So to set the stage for you guys, we first have to look at the mechanics of academic policy debate.
Right, because for decades, the format was very straightforward. You have an affirmative team that proposes a specific policy plan, say reforming a specific maritime trade law to reduce shipping emissions.
Sure.
Then you have a negative team that argues against that specific plan. Usually they do that by pointing out logistical flaws or, economic costs. But over the years, this dominant trend emerged where debaters started using critical theory to just circumvent this specific policy entirely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because zooming out from the specific policy seems like it would be a total violation of the debate rules.
You'd think so, yeah.
Right. Like, if I say we should reform a trade law, and you refuse to talk about the trade law, how does that win an argument?
Well, the debater, using the critical theory, which is often called a critique with a K in these circles, they argue that the entire underlying system is fundamentally irredeemably flawed.
So they just ignore the trade law entirely.
Pretty much. Instead of debating the mundane details of maritime law, they argue that the proposed law exists within global capitalism or the modern nation-state. And because those overarching systems are inherently oppressive, any policy operating within them just has to be rejected outright.
Wow.
Yeah. The argument is essentially that you cannot fix the plumbing in a house if the very concept of shelter is an oppressive construct.
Which, I mean, that feels like a massive leap. If my car engine is smoking, I don't want to engage in a philosophical discussion about the ethical implications of the combustible engine.
Right. You just want to put out the fire.
Exactly. I want to fix the root cause of the smoke so my car doesn't explode. But the paper argues that focusing on the root cause in the specific, abstract way is actually a dangerous trap.
It really is. And the danger lies in a logical mechanism known as the nirvana fallacy.
A nirvana fallacy.
Yeah. So the nirvana fallacy occurs when someone dismisses a real, feasible, messy proposal by comparing it to an unrealistic, idealized utopia. Like a utopia where all the systemic root causes of a problem have just miraculously vanished.
Oh, I see.
So the paper critiques this constant demand for what it calls epistemic priority.
Right, an epistemic priority being the idea that the way we think about the world, like our overarching knowledge and belief system, has to be completely revolutionized before we can take a single practical step.
That is the core of it, yeah. It's the demand that a total shift in mindset absolutely must happen prior to any practical action.
Which is wild.
It is. The paper argues that demanding this pure, totalizing shift in worldview before you agree to alleviate immediate on-the-ground suffering is an insult to the people who are currently suffering.
Yeah, and the paper uses this lifeguard analogy that just perfectly illustrates how absurd this gets in practice.
Oh, that analogy is great.
It's so good. So imagine a lifeguard watching someone actively drown in the ocean. A bystander yells, "Throw them a life preserver." And the lifeguard refuses.
Just flat out refuses.
Right? They refuse, arguing that if everyone had just recognized the inherent dangers of the ocean and stayed on the beach in the first place, there would be no need for lifeguards. So the lifeguard insists on rejecting the entire system of swimming rather than throwing the life preserver.
But wait, wouldn't looking at the root cause, like ocean safety, usually be a good thing?
Well, sure, in theory. But while you're lecturing about ocean safety, the person is drowning. You have to save them first. And the author provides a more grounded historical example from the text that is quite jarring.
Yeah, it highlights how telling marginalized communities to stop focusing on their immediate issues, like securing reliable food or fixing local infrastructure, is deeply problematic, especially when you tell them that fixing those things just leaves broader oppressive power structures in place.
Right. The paper has that striking comparison. It says telling poor communities not to focus on immediate survival is like telling starving Africans to go vegan to reject colonialist food aid.
Exactly. It weaponizes theoretical purity against actual human survival. It forces this complete false binary.
It's what the paper calls the try or die trap, right?
Yes. The logic presented in these debates goes, once I prove the capitalist system is flawed, you must reject it entirely, or the system will inevitably collapse and we all die.
It's very apocalyptic.
Highly apocalyptic.
Yeah.
But the paper notes that the risk of systemic failure isn't the same as the absolute certainty of it. When you equate a flawed system with imminent guaranteed doom, you create a paralysis where no incremental progress is allowed at all.
So let's move from the theoretical trap into the real-world consequences. Because the author makes it super clear that this mindset bleeds far beyond high school or college debate rounds. This distraction by abstraction has literally cost lives in historical policy decisions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paper examines the 1993 crisis in Bosnia.
Right.
Thousands of civilians were dying in a brutal ethnic conflict. But within the United States and among international policymakers, there was this profound paralysis.
People just weren't doing anything.
Exactly. Politicians and public intellectuals criticized intervention heavily, but they did so without offering any practical, on-the-ground alternatives to actually stop the violence.
Because they were caught up in debating the moral purity of Western intervention itself. Right. Like, was intervening just another form of Western imperialism? Does using military force inherently validate the military-industrial complex?
Precisely. The source material notes that these policymakers genuinely believed that high-flown words and moral posturing mattered more than rational calculation. Yeah, they delayed action because they were waiting for an ethically flawless framework to emerge. You know, a framework that didn't have any messy historical baggage.
Which doesn't exist.
Right. And the tragic irony the paper highlights is that after thousands of people died, the intervention that finally took place was incredibly close to the realist, practical proposals that had been roundly condemned on moral grounds months earlier.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second. What if a leader genuinely is motivated by high-level moral theory? Say a leader wants to avoid an atrocity strictly because it violates a universal ethical framework. Does this paper suggest that kind of pure ethical thinking is just completely useless?
Well, the author actually addresses that exact scenario by looking at the advisors trying to dissuade President Harry Truman from using nuclear weapons in 1945.
Oh, right, the Truman example.
Yeah. The paper distinguishes between two types of arguments those advisors could have made. There's extrinsic ethical theory versus an intrinsic alternative.
Okay, so an extrinsic ethical theory would be arguing from entirely outside the system, like telling Truman, you cannot drop this bomb because war itself is a violation of human dignity, and this weapon represents the ultimate moral failure of humanity.
Right. And the paper points out that arguing high-level extrinsic ethical theory to a wartime president was completely useless. It struck Truman and his top commanders as a waste of time, just an academic distraction from the brutal reality of the Pacific theater.
So to actually change the policy, they needed that intrinsic alternative. They needed an option that operated within Truman's existing strategic framework.
Exactly.
And the text points out that an argument to bomb an entirely different city for extrinsic ethical reasons was totally ignored. What Truman really wanted was a practical alternative that proved a will to use, right? Like demonstrating overwhelming power without the mass casualties.
Yeah, and the paper suggests that proposing to bomb critical, unpopulated Japanese oil infrastructure would have been a feasible intrinsic alternative. It addresses the immediate strategic goal, which was demonstrating dominance to an enemy dependent on oil, but without the horrific civilian cost of targeting Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
It's so intense to think about.
Yeah.
Because high-minded ethical purity often masks a fundamental failure to persuade. If you can only argue your point from a utopian, abstract high ground, you basically abandon the messy, practical work of actually convincing the people who hold the levers of power.
You're just using your ethical purity as an excuse for your own inaction.
Right.
And the failure to find that intrinsic alternative means the worst-case scenario often just proceeds unchallenged. The demand for absolute purity removes you from the negotiating table entirely.
So if pure, absolute rejection leads to tragic inaction, how do we fix it? This brings us back to the title of the paper and that flaming sword from the cover art, the Synergy Slayer. How do we actually achieve this synergy?
Well,
like, how do we hold on to major radical ideals while still getting our hands dirty in the real world?
the paper proposes a concept drawn directly from debate theory called the permutation.
The permutation.
Yeah. In debate terminology, a permutation is a test of competition. But in simple terms, it just means doing both. The permutation argues that a proposed plan and the critique of the overarching system are not mutually exclusive.
Okay, so you can do both at the same time.
Exactly. You can absolutely be part of a broader radical movement demanding a new economic or political system while simultaneously voting for a highly specific, imperfect policy that helps people right now.
Oh, I love that. And the text leans on some fascinating historical figures to anchor this point. Like, they bring up Saul Alinsky.
Right, the famous community organizer.
Yeah, and he's quoted giving this wildly pragmatic advice. He argued that effective activists need to learn to, quote, do the right things for the wrong reasons.
Which is a very, very difficult concept for ideological purists to swallow.
Because it feels like a compromise of your soul. But Alinsky understood the mechanics of a pluralist society. To build a coalition large enough to actually pass a law or change a neighborhood, you cannot demand that everyone shares your exact philosophical starting point.
Right.
Like, you might want a new public park because you believe in radical environmental communalism, but your neighbor might want the park just because it increases their property value. Alinsky's point is, don't argue about the philosophy. Just build the park.
Yeah, just get it done. And the paper also brings in the philosopher Slavoj Žižek to reinforce this. Žižek warns against the seductive trap of demanding absolute purity from the outside.
He has that great quote, right?
He does. He points out that for a hardline authoritarian regime, much like the Stalinist era referenced on the paper's cover, a true revisionist working inside the Central Committee is infinitely more valuable and threatening than 1,000 pure radical dissidents just yelling from outside the walls.
Because the person on the inside is actually moving the levers of power. They're creating that synergy.
Exactly. The permutation proves that engaging the state to address a harm is not the same as endorsing the state's foundational flaws.
You could fix the plumbing without declaring the house as a flawless piece of architecture.
Perfectly said. When you demand philosophical purity from your allies, you just fracture your own coalition. Legislation only passes when people with entirely different, sometimes conflicting mindsets unite over a single specific issue.
So that's the pluralistic synergy. But the narrative of the paper takes a darker turn here. It asks us to examine what happens when society abandons that synergy and fully embraces absolute rejection instead.
Right. And before we dive into this part, we should probably add a quick note for our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. Just to be crystal clear up front, we are neutrally reporting the paper's claims here about politically charged events. We are not endorsing these viewpoints or taking any political sides. We're just conveying the ideas exactly as they are laid out in the original source material.
Right. Because this raises an important question regarding the liability of spreading fatalistic rejectionist rhetoric. The author attempts to apply this theory across the modern political spectrum to show how this rhetorical trap isn't just confined to one ideology.
It's everywhere.
It is. The paper argues that when you constantly tell people a system is inevitably doomed and entirely corrupt, you build a direct pipeline to extremism.
And the text looks at the extremes on both ends to prove this. On one side, it points to what the author terms woke fascists.
Right.
It analyzes how certain factions utilize cancel culture to just completely shout down careful, nuanced arguments. And the underlying mechanism there is the belief that standard discourse is inherently violent, which they then use to justify the complete silencing of opposing views.
Yeah, and then it flips to the right wing.
Exactly. It notes how vague, totalizing calls to reject the system and drain the swamp can bypass democratic norms entirely. It can incite real-world violence, and the paper specifically cites the psychology that led to the January 6th Capitol attack as an example of this.
Because when a system is framed as entirely corrupt, unfixable, and actively destroying society, radicalization just becomes the logical next step for anyone who believes that rhetoric.
Right. What else are they supposed to do?
Exactly. And the paper brings in some heavy historical and legal context to analyze the limits of this kind of rhetoric. It references the Dennis and Yates Supreme Court decisions from the 1950s.
The 1950s. So that was the height of the Red Scare.
Yeah.
Those cases were dealing directly with the legality of communist organizing in the U.S., right?
Yes. So in the 1951 case, Dennis v. United States, the Supreme Court upheld the convictions of Communist Party leaders under the Smith Act. They ruled that advocating the violent overthrow of the government is not protected speech if it creates a clear and present danger.
Okay.
But then a few years later, in Yates v. United States, the court dialed that back slightly. They created a distinction between advocating an abstract doctrine, which is simply believing the government should be overthrown theoretically, and advocating specific, concrete illegal actions.
Got it. And the author seems to be using these historical cases to highlight a really pressing modern danger.
Yeah.
If debate formats, or by extension our entire modern media ecosystem, constantly reward and amplify totalizing calls to overthrow the system, they might be crossing that legal line. They're moving from abstract doctrine into a psychological space that historically precedes actual violence.
And the paper connects this all the way back to the cover art, specifically to Stalin. It points out how the Soviet regime eventually treated the purity of communist doctrine as far more important than the millions of human lives lost enforcing it.
Which is horrifying.
It is, because once the abstract theoretical system becomes more important than the messy reality of human beings, atrocities invariably follow.
And the text explains the exact mechanism that accelerates this process too, the echo chamber.
Right, the echo chamber. Because ideological isolation blocks corrective feedback. When you only interact with people who share your demand for ideological purity, you lose the ability to self-correct or even to see the flaws in your own logic.
Yeah, opposing groups stop looking like fellow citizens with different ideas and they start looking like existential threats. And viewing your political opponents as an existential threat rather than a debate opponent is the direct precursor to institutional collapse.
It's incredibly heavy material to process.
It really is.
Yeah.
But to relieve some of this intense historical tension, the author uses a very specific rhetorical pivot here.
Yeah, he does.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The paper is actually dedicated to the author's Soviet-born grandfather, Ivan. And it explores how Soviet citizens historically used dark, absurd, recursive jokes to defeat the absolute fallacies of communism.
Because sometimes, logical arguments just fail to point out the flaw in an entrenched ideology. But absurdity hits the nail right on the head.
Exactly.
So the author crafts this multi-part joke to mock the debate logic we've been discussing all episode, and it perfectly encapsulates the nirvana fallacy.
Okay, walk us through the joke. I love this part.
So, imagine a staunch academic debate critic. He is sitting with a friend who is absolutely starving. The friend reaches out to eat a single pea. But the critic slaps his hand away and says, before you eat that one pea, you must first philosophically defend the entire biopolitical health management system. You must defend the historical atrocities of biological management before you can have a snack.
Because to the critic, eating the pea is an act of participating in the global agricultural and biological system, which obviously has a deeply flawed history.
Right.
Therefore, in his mind, eating the pea endorses all those flaws.
Exactly. And the joke escalates from there. Later, the same debate critic is driving a car after having far too much to drink. He is swerving all over the road, debating whether he should pull over.
Naturally.
Suddenly, a hallucinated talking beer bottle appears in the passenger seat, and the bottle tells him that pulling over to the side of the road is still an act of participating in the inherently flawed, state-sanctioned drunk driving management system.
So the critic is totally paralyzed. He realizes that whether he keeps driving or pulls over, he is still operating within an impure system.
Right. So unable to find a philosophically pure option, he just keeps driving, crashes the car, and kills a chicken that happened to be crossing the road.
The famous chicken crossing the road. But the punchline is why the chicken died.
Yes.
The chicken died because it had evolved to the intellectual level of an academic debater. It was standing dead center in the middle of the road, completely fixated on rethinking its own overarching systemic origins.
The whole chicken versus egg starting point.
Exactly. It was too busy debating the chicken and the egg to notice the car.
It's absurd, but the analysis behind the absurdity is razor sharp. Being relentlessly fixated on finding the perfect theoretical starting point, the pure mindset, the ultimate root cause of your existence, it literally blinds you to the immediate, practical, 2-ton vehicle heading right for you.
While you were debating the architectural integrity and historical origins of the house, the living room is actively on fire.
Yeah, exactly.
So, bringing this all directly back to you, the listener, where in your life, your work, or your community are you letting the abstract, perfect ideal be the enemy of the practical, messy good? Are there coalitions you aren't building because your potential allies don't use the exact right vocabulary or share your theoretical starting point?
It's a vital question, and I want to leave you with one final striking thought drawn straight from the source material. The author actually cites Star Wars to make this final point.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he points out that Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Anakin only a Sith deals in absolutes. And it's worth considering if your own ideological absolutes are secretly turning you into the very thing you are fighting against. Because when you abandon that beautiful, messy pluralism, you abandon the only thing that actually makes progress possible.